Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Ian Boardley. I'm going to present to you another piece of work from the Clean Sport Alliance and the Respect project this afternoon. This is one of our earlier work packages. It was a review of quantitative research evidence relevant to anti-doping in clean sport. So you've seen the video from the qualitative review, or hopefully you've had a chance to see that, and now this one is a review that we conducted looking at quantitative research on this topic. And I'd like to thank Martin Chandler, who actually conducted the review as well, and also this is presented on behalf of all of my colleagues who are in the Respect Consortium, in particular Sue Backhouse and Andrea Petrosi, all of whom contributed to this review and its design. So as I mentioned, this is just one presentation as part of many of the work packages that we're running as part of the Respect project, and the purpose of this review, alongside the other review and the focus group interviews, was to contribute to some of the later work packages, and one of these was a 10-year research agenda for clean sport research, and that video will be presented next week, but this was contributing in terms of content to inform that research agenda in terms of identifying what some of the gaps in the literature were. So through these reviews we could identify where the gaps in the literature were, and then we could through the Delphi project through the Delphi project that we run in the research agenda, identify what the key areas for future research are based on those gaps. But also it's contributing to the knowledge exchange platform that hopefully you might have had a chance to have a look at by now as well, and that knowledge exchange platform is going to host some key studies and summaries of research, and obviously this review is important in identifying what some of those key studies and pieces of research might be. So this was an important work package informing some of the other pieces of work that we conducted as well. So in terms of the review of evidence, you can see that Martin had quite a job in terms of sifting through the research evidence. His initial searches were identifying over 4,000 records of possible studies, but through a process of taking out the duplicate studies, ones that don't fit with our criteria for inclusion in the review, he managed to boil that down into 149 empirical studies. So quantitative studies that had looked at clean sport and anti-doping. So just in terms, firstly, to look at some of the study characteristics. I think the study characteristics are important because they tell us where what type of research has been conducted, and also some of the populations that are being represented in there, because that, for our purposes, but also for our understanding of the knowledge base at the moment, it allows us to identify where the focus has been, and also where the gaps are and where we need to do further work, and to improve the designs of our research, and which populations we sample in that research as well. So as you can see here, in terms of study design, out of those 149 studies, there's a real dominance of cross-sectional research. So that's research that's conducted just at a single point in time, so it's just given us a snapshot of what's happening, and in terms of research design, we really want to be conducting more longitudinal research, so we can understand how variables change over time, how some variables might influence others over time as well, but also we need to be conducting research that evaluates programs over time as well. So there's obviously a real gap there in terms of developing and utilizing more advanced research designs, and that probably ties into to funding issues and some of the reasons why it's difficult to conduct some of that more advanced research and research using those advanced designs. And that's something that we address specifically when we talk about the research agenda and some of the possible mechanisms we need to support that type of research, and that'll be covered in more detail in the later video. In terms of the geographical region, so this is where the research was actually conducted, so where populations were sampled from. You can see there's a real dominance here in terms of research in Europe, with over 100 studies being conducted in Europe. But also if you look at this in terms of westernized nations, you can see that there's a real dominance of research sampling populations from westernized populations. So we really need to sort of expand our research into other areas of the globe if we're to fully understand clean sport and doping and behaviours and anti-doping, and in particular into Asia, because there's a real deficit in research that's been conducted in Asia. And when we think about the possibilities in terms of cultural differences and regional differences, we're really not going to be able to understand clean sport globally unless we start to conduct more research into those other regions that haven't been covered so far. Okay, if we look at next in terms of gender, we actually see that the majority of studies, so 115 studies, have utilised mixed gender samples. So that's good in terms of gender representation. I mean, overall, within those studies, there's probably still a dominance of male athletes in there, but the majority of studies are including athletes. So majority of the studies were conducted with athletes from male and female athletes. Not all the studies report that, as you can see that there, but when we have got studies that look specifically at particular gender, so males or females, then we do see that there's a dominance in males as well. So there's clearly a need for more research that specifically looks at female athletes and females in particular. Because if we also look at which groups have been examined in this research, we see that almost all of the studies have looked at athletes. So there's a range in terms of competitive level, but the majority, only 4 studies are athlete support personnel. So that's showing that we've got a real need to do more research looking at athlete support personnel and the influence of athlete support personnel on athletes in terms of their support for clean sport and their own knowledge and development of clean sport behaviours themselves. Okay, so what we did with the 149 studies then was we looked to see what were sort of the consistent themes and a logical way in which we could group the research and then summarise the findings within each of those areas. And the first of those groups was that we identified was psychosocial antecedents. So this is research that's looked at particular psychological, social variables that might influence someone's attitude towards doping, their intentions to dope, or their actual reported doping behaviours, for example. So here we're trying to understand some of the psychological factors, the social, environmental factors that might be influencing propensity to dope, or potentially more recently to propensity to engage in clean sport behaviours. And this was the largest theme that we saw. Secondly, we identified a theme of descriptive research. So this is research that's looking to describe what the finding within a population. So it's not really looking at the association between two variables. It's just describing particular characteristics of a population that's been sampled on particular variables relevant to doping. Thirdly, we've got methodological studies. So these are studies that are designing things relevant to research methods. And in the majority of studies here, it's psychometric scales. So the majority of these studies in this category are developing psychometric scales that can be utilised in some of the other areas of research, such as the psychosocial antecedents. So some of the psychological variables that might be linked to doping, or some of the other doping outcomes that are examined in terms of doping attitudes or doping intentions, we need valid and reliable measures to assess them. So in these methodological studies, these are the processes of developing those measures, but also then validating them. Fourthly, we've got a category whereby research is mainly developed but always evaluated intervention programs or existing education programs delivered by national anti-doping organisations, for instance. So these are, they all include some evaluation of interventions, and some of them also include the development of those interventions as well. So an appraisal of how effective those interventions have been. And then lastly, we've got a category of research where we're looking at group differences. So we might be making a comparison on certain psychological variables or knowledge or attitudes towards doping between, say, males and females, or different levels of competition, for instance, where we're looking to see whether, is there greater knowledge in one category of athlete compared to another category of athlete, to give us an idea of, for example, where we might need to target intervention, for instance. So firstly, if we look at the psychosocial antecedents category, as I say, this was the largest thematic group, so we had 55 studies that fit into this category. As I say, these were psychosocial predictors of doping outcomes, and we can see a range of doping outcomes utilised. So some studies look at actual self-reported doping, for instance, and you will even get some studies that have actually done some analysis, some chemical analysis to look for evidence of doping. But also other studies will use other doping outcomes such as intentions to dope or susceptibility to doping, and looking to see whether certain psychological psychosocial variables are predictive of those doping outcomes, so we can generate and build our understanding of what psychological processes and psychological factors might be important in determining whether an athlete is more or less likely to dope, for instance. And a couple of theories dominated here in terms of, so quite often the hypotheses, the research questions are developed around particular and informed by particular theories, and two particular theories were dominant here. The first one was the theory of planned behaviour, which has certainly been a dominant theory in anti-doping and doping research over the years. And what was generally found, so this theory suggests that the perceptions of those around us and whether we think those people around us would be supportive of our decisions to dope. If we think people would be more supportive, we're more likely to engage in the behaviour. It also proposes that our perceived behavioural control is important. So the more control that we feel as though we have over a particular behaviour, so doping in this particular case, then if it's a behaviour that would be considered inappropriate, then the more control we have over that behaviour, so that would be not doping in this instance, then we'd be less likely to engage in the behaviour. Or the counter to that is the more we feel in control of the behaviour. So for doping, that could be interpreted in terms of whether you have access to substances, whether you have the knowledge on how to actually engage in the behaviour, then that would be more predictive of the behaviour. In terms of doping attitudes, the more positive, the more favourable our attitudes towards a behaviour are, then the more likely we are to engage in the behaviour. And what the theory also proposes is that these other factors influence our actual engagement in the behaviour through their effect, at least in part, on doping, on intentions to engage in the behaviour. So here, in terms of doping intentions, and by and large, what the evidence base shows is support for this theory, that these are important factors in determining whether someone engages in doping behaviour or not. And then the other important theory in this area was the social cognitive theory of thought and action, so Bandura's 1991 theory. And what this proposes, the importance and variables that have often been examined in this type of research are moral disengagement, self-efficacy beliefs, quite often self-regulatory efficacy, and anticipated guilt. And the suggestion being that the more, so in terms of self-regulatory efficacy, the more confident we are in our ability to resist engaging in a behaviour, if it's a behaviour that would be considered inappropriate, the less likely we are to engage in that behaviour. And that would be mediated by something called moral disengagement, which is our ability to rationalise and justify engaging in behaviours that go against our moral standards. So we acknowledge and recognise that it's a behaviour we shouldn't probably engage in, which is highly relevant to doping. And that in turn operates through our anticipated guilt. So we're not likely to engage in behaviours that we anticipate feeling bad about. So if we perceive that we'll feel guilty as a result of doping, then we wouldn't engage in the behaviour. But what the theory suggests is that the more able we are to rationalise and justify and come up with explanations for why it's okay to engage in that behaviour in a particular situation. So, if we're thinking about cycling in the 90s and when it was perceived that many athletes were doping, it's much easier to rationalise that behaviour because it's something that everyone's engaging in, and that is an example of moral disengagement. Then we don't anticipate feeling guilty as a result, and then we can engage in that behaviour more freely. And again, similar to the theory of planned behaviour, the literature base as a whole, the studies that have looked at this theory have found support for the importance of these variables, and in particular, the moral disengagement is probably the one that's received the most research attention to date. And there's also a small number of studies that looked at coaching influences as well. So, for instance, looking at athletes' perceptions of their coaches' ability and confidence in their ability to actually confront an athlete if they're engaging in or look like they're at risk of engaging in doping behaviour. So how likely is that is a coach to confront doping issues and doping behaviours, with the suggestion being that the more an athlete perceives their coach is able and confident to engage in and confront an athlete, the less likely that athlete is to engage in doping behaviours. And we've seen support for that suggestion as well, so therefore highlighting the importance of athlete support personnel and athletes' perceptions of them, and in particular coaches. The next category of studies was, as I mentioned earlier, the descriptive research, and this was the second largest thematic group, with almost 50 studies falling into this category, and these were looking to try and describe populations, and in particular the most important attribute that was looked at in these studies was knowledge. Most studies looked at athletes and athletes' knowledge of anti-doping and doping processes. So in particular the studies that looked at athletes, and there were a small number of studies that looked at athlete support personnel as well, what they're looking at is the type of content, the type of knowledge you would get through educational activities. So quite often it's looking to see whether there's evidence that athletes and athlete support personnel have sufficient knowledge to make good decisions around doping. So do they understand which are the banned substances and methods, for instance, or do they understand the process of test collection and how to avoid whereabouts failures, for example, but also understanding around the potential harms, because there's suggesting that might be might reduce someone's likelihood of doping, but also our understanding of inadvertent doping, so accidental doping, and do we really know what behaviours we have to engage in to minimise the risk of unintentional doping. And across the literature base as a whole, certainly identifying that there's some deficits both in terms of athletes' knowledge and athlete support personnel knowledge. So, highlighting the importance for effective education around these topics. In terms of the third category, these are methodological studies, and these are studies really that are helping support some of the research in the other categories. So in order to do very good research that's looking at psychosocial predictors of doping outcomes, we need to have valid and reliable measures that we can utilise to capture and assess these psychological variables that we might be looking at in those studies. So perhaps not unsurprisingly, when you actually look more detail at what these studies have been doing, they've been developing measures that tie into some of those theories that I mentioned earlier. So explicit attitudes, for example, we've got 4 studies that detail the development and validation of attitude measures. So if you think about the theory of planned behaviour and attitudes being important to that theory, then you can see why other studies have been developing these measures. And likewise, you can see we've got 3 studies there developing measures around moral disengagement, and also 3 looking at the development of self-efficacy measures. And these aren't necessarily separate studies, so some of these papers develop, say, for instance, measures of moral disengagement and self regulatory efficacy within the same paper to support research in the area of some of those theories. But we also have got 5 papers that have looked at implicit association tests. So these are tests that are looking to try and capture associations, attitudes that maybe operate at a subconscious level, so we're not necessarily consciously aware of. And there's certainly a sort of burgeoning area of research that's looking to try and capture and understand these sort of these processes that might operate at the subconscious level that might be influencing our propensity to dope as well. So that certainly seems to be an emerging area of literature, as you can see by the number of studies that have committed themselves to try and develop these tests. Then in terms of intervention evaluations, so we're starting to see a drop off in the number of papers here, and obviously, you know, if you're going to develop and evaluate an intervention, that can be quite an involved process, and also needs sufficient research funding to do that. So perhaps not surprising that we're seeing lower numbers, but we obviously need to, if we're going to develop impactful and effective evaluations, we also need to be doing this type of research. So hopefully, you know, in the coming years, and when you look at the research agenda, in the later video, you'll see that there's an emphasis and a need to do more research in this area. In terms of the review, so we had 15 papers in this area that were all evaluating intervention programs, so either specific interventions that have been developed for use with athletes to try and reduce the risk, the likelihood that someone will engage in doping, or education programs that have been developed by national anti-doping organisations that are then being evaluated for their effectiveness. And these, the 3 that you see on the screen mentioned here, are the ones that received the most attention. They're also ones that have been around for the longest time. Certainly the Athena and Atlas programs are ones that have been known about and been available for some considerable time now. So there's the Athena program is one that targets female athletes in particular, and this was evaluated in 3 studies. And across those 3 studies, there was some positive findings in terms of the effectiveness of this program. All of the studies were longitudinal studies, and they all involved large samples, so there were robust evaluations of what is quite an involved program for female athletes, and they also saw influence on athletes' intentions to engage in the behaviour, so reduced intentions to utilise prohibited substances as a result of receiving the program. And then similar for the Atlas program, which is the male equivalent, we also saw some positive results there. For these studies, there were some important interactions that suggested that who's receiving the intervention might be important in determining how effective the intervention is. So, for example, athletes who came onto the program that had the least amount of knowledge, that's where we saw the increases in knowledge, the greatest increases in knowledge, perhaps. A not surprising finding, but suggesting that, you know, if people have already got an existing high level of knowledge, then maybe they're not going to benefit that much from receiving the program. But similarly, athletes who had the greatest intentions to use prohibited substances when they came onto the program were the ones who showed the greatest decrease in intentions. And that's definitely supportive of the program, and it's important, you know, when it's delivered to people that are at particular risk for using prohibited substances, then it seems that it's having the most effect based on the findings from these studies. Again, these were longitudinal studies and with large samples, so robust evaluations as well. And then finally, there's the Saturn program. Again, support for the effectiveness of this program with decreases in intentions or reported use of illicit drug use and performance-enhancing drug use from this program. And this is quite a unique program, because as you can see from the title there, it actually involves in the testing of athletes as an incorporated element of the program. The remaining evaluations that were done tended to be individual papers looking at the evaluations of individual programs or interventions that had been developed. So these were the ones that focused on where there was more than one study looking at a particular program. And then the final category was those looking at group differences. So here, this was the smallest category we had, with just 11 papers that were focused on looking at differences in doping-related attitudes and behaviour. 7 of these papers, and so the biggest area was looking at across different sport types. And although we saw some differences in particular studies and within particular studies, but we didn't see a consistent pattern of differences across the body of literature. So it wasn't that we could say individual sports had different levels of attitudes compared to team sports. So there was no sort of consistent pattern that could be determined from across those 7 studies. 3 of the studies explored gender differences in doping attitudes, and what we did see here was a more consistent finding in terms we saw males consistently having more favourable attitudes towards doping. And also, in a similar vein, we also saw another paper that looked at male athletes against female athletes, but in terms of how many athletes they knew had doped. And what that paper showed was that males reported knowing more athletes who doped than female athletes did. So both of these findings are highlighting that being a male athlete tends to be put you at greater risk of doping than being a female athlete, in terms of some of the psychological attitudes towards the behaviour, but also in terms of how many athletes people have known. And this also ties in with other studies that have shown higher levels of self-reported doping in male athletes compared to females. And then finally we had 3 studies that looked at differences across competitive level, but similar to what we saw for different sport types, we didn't see any consistent differences here. So it wasn't as if athletes that were competing at the highest level seemed to be at greater risk or to be reporting higher levels on doping variables than those at lower levels. So there didn't seem to be any particular risk coming from competitive levels, as you might anticipate there would be differences. They were not certainly detected in these 3 studies. So just to summarise some of the key findings from the review, as I mentioned, we've got 149 papers in the review, so I think this highlights the amount of research that's been conducted in this area. And within the review we also looked to see how that had changed over time, and what you see is that in recent years, as funding has become more available for this type of research, for research in the area of clean sport and anti-doping, we've seen a definite rise in the social science research in this area. So that's good. That's definitely a good thing for us to report. What we also see though is that there's a real dominance of cross-sectional research, so that research that's just given us a single snapshot in time of what we're seeing in a particular population. So what we really need to see now, I think, is a change in terms of the type of research researchers are doing, and that if that means doing fewer studies but making them higher quality and using more longitudinal designs, because as a report we've tended to see that longitudinal research in those evaluation studies. But what would be nice to see is to see some longitudinal research in some of those studies that are looking at the psychological factors that might influence doping, or longitudinal research that's over a much longer term to look at some of those developmental influences on doping attitudes and behaviours. But obviously that requires more significant research funding, or a reduced breadth of research, but more depth in the individual studies that we do run, in terms of designing our research programs. There's obviously been that real dominance in westernized nations as well, so we definitely need more research in Asia, in other regions of the world, so that we can understand, we can determine whether some of those theories that we've seen support for are supported when we apply them into within other cultures in other regions of the globe, so we can fully understand what might be explaining doping behaviour across the globe. Very good in terms of gender representation. The majority of studies are looking at males and females in the same studies, and by and large controlling for gender, because as we've seen in some of those group differences studies, we do see differences between males and females, so we need to be accounting for that and controlling for those effects in the research that we conduct. But there probably is a need for more research that specifically looks at females, because as we know, say if we're doing research in the areas of supplements, for instance, quite often supplement behaviours and supplement use behaviours are quite different across males and females, so there are definitely particular research questions that we need to look at, and particular behaviours where we might want to look in particular and specifically at female athletes, and there's not a great deal of research like that that's been conducted to date. And then finally, research on psychosocial antecedents and descriptive research is what's dominated in this area. So we need to be doing more evaluations of interventions and more development of interventions, but also particularly evaluation of existing programs, of education programs, and I think we're going to see an increased amount of that as we see the international standard for education come in, because monitoring and evaluation is an integral element of that. So what would be really nice to see is researchers working with national anti-doping organisations to conduct robust evaluations of those programs that are being used with athletes, and ideally athlete support personnel as well, because that's certainly an area we need more research as well, looking at the influence of athlete support personnel, because as we reported here, we only identified 4 studies that had looked in particular at athlete support personnel. So hopefully you found that that video on our quantitative review interesting. We hope to see you on December the 8th and 9th at the second Clean Sport Insight Forum, which due to the current coronavirus pandemic will be a virtual event this year. So we're really excited to be presenting this in a different format, and we really hope you'll be able to join us. You can find more information on that at the cleansportalliance.org, or by following us on Twitter to keep up with the updates. And if you go to cleansportalliance.org, you'll be able to sign up for the weekly newsletters that are giving you all the information that's coming out of our projects on a weekly basis. So thank you.